In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the Vietnam War, how it got started, and the results. The Indo-Chinese Peninsula was a French colony. That was until the Vietnamese communists, led by Ho Chi Minh, were able to get the French to surrender and get them out of the area. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam into North Vietnam and South Vietnam at roughly the 17th parallel. The communists under Ho Chi Minh controlled North Vietnam, and South Vietnam was controlled by a dictator named Ngo Dinh Diem. He had the support of the United States, but was not popular. His actions were not popular with his people and alienated the people that he controlled. The Geneva Accords allowed for the scheduling of free elections, but those were never held because America was concerned that Ho Chi Minh would overwhelmingly win those elections. So those elections were never held, and instead Vietnam remained divided. The concern with Vietnam going communist relates to what we call the domino theory, the fear with if Vietnam went communist, like tipping a row of dominoes, the neighbors of Vietnam would go communist as well. Using the unpopularity of the South Vietnamese leader, the North Vietnamese communists are going to create the Viet Cong. These are South Vietnamese communist supporters that want North Vietnam to take control of South Vietnam. So they're civilians not in uniform, and our soldiers are now going to have to deal with, upon their arrival, of the North Vietnamese army that they're going to fight against, and against the Viet Cong, who were in and among the civilian population. This is going to prove extremely difficult for American servicemen to deal with in Vietnam. The event that's going to bring large-scale numbers of American troops to Vietnam is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And in this incident, off the coast of North Vietnam, 2 U.S. destroyers are attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and here we see President Lyndon Johnson talking to the American people on television about the fact that he has now been given the authorization from Congress to take all necessary measures to repel the attack. This is now going to lead to large numbers of troops moving from the United States to Vietnam. Notice that I didn't use the words declare war on Vietnam. There was no formal declaration of war. The Vietnam War is known more as a police action, technically. And here we see various pictures of U.S. soldiers going on search and destroy missions. They're looking for North Vietnamese Army, of course. They're also looking for Viet Cong, who hid in many of the different villages. This was an extremely difficult situation for American service personnel trying to work with over there. Because again, the Viet Cong were dressed as civilians, not in a military uniform. An additional difficulty that this map indicates is that the North Vietnamese Army would cut through Laos and Cambodia using what was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and then turn around, enter South Vietnam, and attack American service personnel, South Vietnamese Army, in South Vietnam, and then basically go back across the border into Cambodia, where we had no authority to go after them. President Johnson ordered bombing sorties on North Vietnam, and thousands of such missions hit almost every single road and rail bridge in the country, as well as 4,000 of North Vietnam's almost 6,000 villages. As the war went on through 1964, 65, 66, 67, it became increasingly unpopular, and you're looking at photos here of various protests that took place in cities across the country. You can see there were some large ones in our nation's capital. University campuses were very common places for protest. That's partly because the draft law that was issued at the time included a provision that if you went to college, you could delay your being drafted into the Army. So people that may not have even ordinarily thought about going to college applied and went so that they could be deferred and hopefully, 4 or 5 years later, the war would have ended at that point. They would not have had to serve. What that also means is that our combat troops were disproportionately from groups that were less likely to go to college. Here you're looking at a picture of a shooting that took place at Kent State University in Ohio. You can see here 4 students were killed by National Guard troops, which again only continued to ramp up the escalation of additional protests, to the point where President Johnson in 1967 announced publicly he was not going to seek re-election. So at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, Johnson was a Democrat, George McGovern was the candidate became the candidate for president in the 68 election. He would lose to Richard Nixon, in part because Richard Nixon was elected in part because of a promise that he had a secret plan to end the war. This was called the Nixon Doctrine, which was formally unveiled in July of 1969, and it called on Asian nations to be more self-reliant in defense matters. This strategy was called Vietnamization, which meant making the South Vietnamese fight the war without U.S. troops. The irony here is that Nixon actually expanded the war in Vietnam into Cambodia, as we see here in this photo, where he's talking to America about the issue I just spoke to you a moment ago, where the Ho Chi Minh Trail and North Vietnamese troops using Cambodia as a safe haven, if you will, away from U.S. troops, because we were not operating in Cambodia. So initially, this starts secretly. We're bombing in Cambodia, again looking to flush out those North Vietnamese Army troops. All right, but it becomes public, as you can see here. I should point out that even while this was going on, Nixon had already sent his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, to the Paris peace talks, talking with the North Vietnamese Army and VC representatives, Viet Cong representatives. The result of the talks in Paris was a 60-day ceasefire to give the United States time to get out of South Vietnam. And you see the photos here of Americans being airlifted out. The photo on the top right is actually on top of the U.S. Embassy building in Saigon. All right, so as the clock ticked down on the 60 days, Americans were gotten out. A number of South Vietnamese were taken out, but there were only so many people that they could take. Ultimately, we left, and the war continued to rage on for about 2 more years between the North Vietnamese Army and South Vietnamese Army, leading to a reunification of Vietnam when the NVA takes over the capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, renaming it Ho Chi Minh City. And true to form, unfortunately, Vietnam managed to flip Cambodia and Laos as communist nations. That's really the story for another time, basically beyond the scope of this course at the moment. So just to sum up then, U.S. aids South Vietnam to prevent a communist takeover by North Vietnam. This is, containment policy, Truman Doctrine, if you will. The U.S. is fighting, we're fighting to assist an unpopular leader who actually dies early in the war, so we're just assisting at that point the South Vietnamese military. All right, and we're fighting the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong. All right, and this is really an untenable situation for us. As the war drags on, it becomes more unpopular at home, and this is going to cost Johnson his presidency. All right, the U.S. withdraws in 1973. Vietnam is reunited as a communist nation in 1975. And as I mentioned a moment ago, Laos and Cambodia become communist countries as well.